You can learn a lot about a musical by reading the book. You can learn even more when the orchestra starts speaking to you. They can tell you the truth. They can even lie to you. They can warn you. They can tell you quietly that the person singing center stage doesn't fully understand the world that they're standing in. That's the thing I've been thinking about all week as I put this episode together. Because if the first episode in this trilogy was about where Dis-topia comes from, and the second episode was about how the script was built, then this third episode had to be about the thing that makes the show breathe. The score. Not just the songs that people remember first, or even the biggest titles. Not even the novelty of hearing an Epcot musical with a cryogenically preserved Walt Disney singing lines that sound like they wandered out of a fever dream somewhere between Tomorrowland, Assassins, and a cursed corporate orientation video. I mean the actual music mind of the piece. The way Robby Good's score shapes tone. The way the orchestrations move between sincerity and satire. The way character lives inside timbre. The way the show uses repetition, recurrence, and thematic transformation to turn a strange premise into something emotionally coherent. And I also want to talk about something else that frankly deserves attention all on its own. The sheer scale of what this team pulled off. One of the things that public reporting and the official project pages made very clear was that Dis-topia did not stop at being an independent original musical with a strong script and an ambitious production history. The show's final 2024 production was mounted with a mid-20s orchestra, and the full cast recording that followed in 2025 was not just a sampler or a 5-song teaser. It was a full album release, 25 tracks, roughly 86 minutes, including not only the major songs but underscore cues and connective tissue. There had already been a smaller 6-track experimental prototype EP in 2024, which makes the full album feel even more like the completion of a long musical developmental process. I don't want that point to get lost, because independent musicals don't casually just do that. They don't just casually end up with a pro shot, a full cast recording, and a mid-20s orchestra attached to a student-born, independently produced piece. Good's own site says the 2024 premiere was independently produced by the creators and played to more than 900 attendees. And the Daily Bruin described the production as his master's thesis and quoted him talking about the orchestra as a character in the show. It's fair to say, as an inference from those facts, that this is a highly unusual level of musical and archival ambition for an independent production. And the reason I want to start there is that scale tells you something. It tells you what the creators believe the show was. Not a novelty. Not a clever little one-off. Not a wouldn't it be funny if concept that got more attention than anyone expected and then evaporated. This team treated the score as if it mattered enough to preserve properly. They treated the orchestra as if it was not decoration, but part of the storytelling identity of the show. They treated the music as one of the central things the piece actually is. And after spending time with the script and the materials around it, I think that instinct was exactly right. Because Dis-topia is one of those musicals where the book gives you the argument, but the score gives you the atmosphere of the argument. The book tells you who is speaking, of course, but the music tells you what the world is saying. It tells you what the people want. It tells you how they have learned to want it. And in this show, that matters enormously, because Dis-topia is built on competing emotional languages. Vera does not feel the world the way Katz feels it. Katz does not hear the city the way Walt hears it. And Walt does not imagine the future the way the workers live in it. And the score has to make those differences audible, not just explainable. That's one of the reasons I was so struck by Robby's comments in the Daily Bruin piece. He described the music as getting to be a character in the show and said that if you listen to the soundtrack, you should be able to hear the arc of the show and the way it moves. He also talked about finding his voice between two very different stylistic sounds. And the article notes his use of classic Disney influences, as well as grunge rock for rougher characters like the Lost Boys, and his emphasis on matching sound to character. That is exactly the right way to think about a score like this. Because Dis-topia cannot survive musically if everything lives in the same vocabulary. If all the songs were written in one unified comic theater mode, the show would just be flat. But if all the songs were pastiche Disney, well then it's just another parody. And if all the songs leaned into rock aggression, the show would lose the sincerity that makes the emotional turns really land with the audience. The score has to hold contradictory musical worlds together and make them feel like they belong to the same city, the same environment, the same universe. And that's the challenge. And I think that's where the score is the most impressive. Not that it has one sound. It has several, and it knows exactly when to let them collide. The official project page describes the show's sound as combining classic Disney-esque nostalgia with a punctuated rock style while still grounding the absurd premise in genuine drama. That is an unusually accurate little summary, actually, because it gets at the core duality of the score. This is not a musical that wants to reject Disney sonically. It wants to inhabit it, then warp it, answer it, punch holes in it, and finally ask what parts of it are still worth keeping. And that's a much more interesting musical project than simple imitation. You can hear it from the very beginning. Take This Happy Place. In script terms, that song is doing the work of prologue and thesis. It's assembling the Walt myth, the funeral frame, the labor conflict, the longing, the rise, the dead dreamer, the corporate machinery, the whole strange stack of emotional and historical material the show is going to keep revisiting. In the script, it's not a tidy opening number so much as a sequence. It moves across time. It moves across registers. It moves across different versions of Walt Disney. That means musically it needs to be more than one thing at once. It needs ceremony, momentum, memory, a sense of ascent, and also a kind of controlled chill. That's a very hard opening assignment. And I think it also tells you something important about how the trio of Good, Deegan, and Torrance are thinking about score architecture. They're not writing from the standpoint of, well, here's the opening song. No, they're writing from the standpoint of, what musical language does this world need before the audience can even understand what genre of truth we're in? That is an entirely different question. A lot of musicals open by just telling you the rules. Dis-topia opens by muddying the rules in a very deliberate way. The score tells you this is theatrical. It tells you this is darkly funny. It's haunted. It tells you Walt is both person and force. And because the opening seems to understand that Walt's legend cannot be separated from conflict, the music does not just celebrate him, it frames him. And that's the first sign that this score is doing real, dramatic, heavy lifting. Then we get City of Tomorrow. And this is where the music really announces one of its central compositional ideas. Surface music and structural music are not the same thing. On the surface, City of Tomorrow has the gleam of a proper welcome number. And it should. The city is literally selling itself. The tour guides are part of the performance layer of Epcot. Walt is part founder, part host, part propaganda voice. So the music needs a polished, smiling, rhythmically organized shape. It needs to feel curated, designed commercially, specifically for anyone coming into the city. But for the purpose of the show, it can't be musically innocent. That's the trap the song has to avoid, because if the song only functions as satire, well then it's just too easy. And if it functions as pure allure, then Underbelly of the Beast, which follows, has to do too much corrective work afterward. What the show really needs is a number that is attractive enough to explain Vera as they enter, structured enough to explain Epcot for what it is in the present moment, and faintly artificial enough that the audience can sense the control underneath it. That is compositional balance. Now, I'm not pretending to have the full conductor's score laid out in front of me here. In fact, if you want to see what that actual score looked like in physical form, you can check out the first video in my two-part series on YouTube. It's literally gigantic. And there's a funny story about how Robby couldn't even print the entire thing. But in broad compositional terms, this is the kind of number that lives or dies on contour, rhythm, and orchestral posture. It has to move cleanly. It has to feel designed. It has to feel like the city has been rehearsing its self-description for years, and this is just another day on another part of the tour. And then the score does something very clever. It lets the floor completely drop out. Underbelly of the Beast matters not only because of what it says lyrically, but because of where it sits musically. The show has just given you order, brightness, and presentation. All smiles. Now it has to give you weight, labor, dirt, and threat, as the smile fades. The contrast is not just merely narrative. It is sonic, and that's where the Disney-ish sheen meets the harsher edge the creators talked about. Robby specifically said the show draws from rougher, more rock-oriented material for characters like the Lost Boys, and you can feel why that would be necessary here. The city above ground may sing one way, but the people trapped below definitely can't. This is a point where I think the score is smarter than it might first appear, because the easy version of the contrast would be to say, well, Disney sound above, rock sound below. And sure, on a broad level, that's kind of the effect, but what actually makes the show more compelling is that those languages keep contaminating one another. The surface world is never entirely clean. The rebellious world is never entirely outside Disney either. Even the Lost Boys are Disney-coded in their own way. I mean, their gang name is the Lost Boys. You know, from Peter Pan. They're not neutral outsiders. They're products of the same mythic machinery that they're fighting. So the score cannot simply cut from one genre to another and be done with it. It needs to keep reminding you that all of this belongs to one ecosystem. That's why I think Dis-topia works best when its musical contrasts are vivid, but not absolute. Now, from there, the score starts distributing character identity. And this is where I want to spend most of the episode, because for me, the most interesting part of the score is not just song quality, it's song placement plus musical point of view. So let's start with Vera. Vera's material, broadly speaking, has to do with one very difficult thing. It has to sound emotionally sincere without becoming vapid. That's a very hard line to walk because Vera is the character most at risk in conceptual terms of becoming too easy to parody. She's the one with the park knowledge. She's the one with all the faith in the Disney emotional promise, with a relationship to wonder that could very easily be played as an airhead or disposable. But the score refuses to let her do that. And that's wise, because the show needs Vera's music to carry genuine lift. It needs melodic openness. It needs room for breath. It needs enough of that older Disney-adjacent yearning shape that when Vera sings, you understand not just what she likes, but what she needs. That's why Satisfied is such an important early number. In the script, Satisfied gives us Vera in the full current of Epcot-adjacent contentment. She wakes up, moves through this systemized environment, and sings from a place of cheer, fluency, and immersion. But the song also places her father Kevin alongside her emotional world, and that matters. He is singing about concern, where she's singing contentment. He sees her as immature, sure, but he's also relieved to see that she's smiling. And that creates a musical environment where Vera's brightness is already being framed by care, anxiety, and parental observation. And that means even her earliest material has more weight than a simple "I love it here" number would have. And then the score keeps evolving that language across Innocence, Never, and Neverland Tomorrow. That arc, to me, is one of the strongest pieces of musical storytelling in the whole show. Because it's not just the same melody type repeated at different plot points. It's a worldview under pressure. Innocence is still recognizably Vera, but now the shape of her music is carrying confusion, rupture, and destabilization after Roller Coaster Tango. Never is the collapse point where her fantasy architecture has been burned through, and the language of Neverland itself is turned against her. And then the finale gives her one last transformation. Not a return to naivety, but a harder one kind of forward motion. The final number's very title, Neverland Tomorrow, tells you the score is trying to reconcile two things that most of the show has forced apart. And that is what good musical writing does. That's why I love this show. It doesn't just attach songs to plot beats. It lets musical vocabulary age. Vera's music does not abandon lyricism. But it can't mean the same thing at the end that it meant at the beginning. If it did, then the score would be emotionally dishonest. And it's not. Now let's compare that to Cats. Cats is not just given darker songs, that'd be too simple. Cats is given propulsion. And that to me is one of the best ways to think about the difference. Vera's music often reaches, whereas Cats' music drives. Cats pushes language, rhythm, and they push the show into sharper edges, more attack, more bite, more irony, more velocity. Roller Coaster Tango is almost a mission statement in that regard. Even the title tells you what kind of compositional game the show is playing. You have attraction language, bodily danger, dance, form, motion, vertigo, and mechanical inevitability all packed together. In the script, the lyric is full of drops, loops, chains, restraint bars, brake runs, automation, and the aggressive thrill of turning the park itself into an instrument of awakening. That's not passive writing. It's kinetically written, and the music has to meet that. This is a level of musical writing on Imagineering scale. They wrote the music like a ride. And we're all in the front row seat for it. Then you get Most People Are Dead, which is one of those titles that tells you immediately the show understands how far it can push tonal extremity if the character voice is strong enough. It's not a polite cynicism, it's a worldview at full voltage, which means the music has to carry certainty, contempt, stamina, and the sense that Cats has rehearsed this position for a very long time. And that's where the rock-inflected side of the score becomes especially useful. Rock music in musical theater is not inherently rebellious, despite how often people use it that way, but rhythmically and texturally, it's very good at carrying agitation, insistence, and forward pressure. that matters for Cats, because Cats cannot sound merely gloomy. Cats has to sound active. Cats has built an identity around refusal. And then, crucially, the score makes room for Break Run. And I love that title so much because it feels like a compositional thesis all by itself. A break run is not just the end of the ride. It's where accumulated motion has to be absorbed. That's exactly what the character needs. If Most People Are Dead is Cats at full ideological momentum, Break Run is the price of having lived that way. The crash of speed into exhaustion, the energy of constant resistance, curdling into grief and depletion. Structurally, that is a beautiful answer song because it gives Cats vulnerability without making the character suddenly unrecognizable. It's not sentimentality, it's spent force. And that's a very mature choice. And now, Walt Disney. Much like every one of his TV intros goes. But with this, Walt is where the score could have gone badly and wrong very easily. Because with something like Walt Disney as a figure, as a character, the temptation would be to write either in pure menace or pure pastiche. Too much menace and he becomes a cartoon villain. Too much pastiche and the show starts congratulating itself for recognizing the joke. What the score needs for Walt is authority, aspiration, and pathology, all at the same time. Which, I don't know if you've figured out by now, but that's also not easy. The songs This Happy Place, Freedom of Control, Freedom of Gratitude, His Happy Place, and Marceline form what I think of as Walt's 5-part musical anatomy. You have the public-facing builder, the authoritarian persuader, then the paternal propagandist, followed up by the private obsessive, and finally, the diminished memory creature at the end. And the score needs to separate those functions without making them feel like 5 different characters had just wandered in from 5 different musicals. This is where leitmotif and thematic recurrence becomes so important. The creators have talked about distinct musical themes for different characters, and the published materials reinforce that this was not accidental. Robby Good described the music as matching character and arc. The project page explicitly highlights the show's blended stylistic identity, and the script itself makes very clear that songs such as This Happy Place, His Happy Place, and Marceline are in dialogue with one another at the level of phrase and idea, and not just title. That's exactly how you want a Walt Disney score line to behave. You want recurrence. You want the audience to keep hearing that this person is trapped inside his own musical self-explanation. Because that is what obsession sounds like in a musical. It's not just a loud villain song. It is material that keeps returning with altered stakes. His Happy Place, in particular, is a really important midpoint in understanding how the score thinks about Walt. In the second episode, I talked about it in script terms. Musically, it's just as important. The scene places Walt with his brother Roy, with the Imagineers, with the animatronic Lincoln, with pressure, with smoke, with the impossibility of separating personal identity from project identity. In the script, Walt insists that Walt Disney doesn't smoke while he smokes, which is a wonderful tiny line because it tells you the mythology and the man are already splitting apart inside himself and the song. Musically, that means the song cannot simply be a power ballad of obsession. It needs fracture inside it. Not just darkness, but fracture. And then, Marceline, which has something even harder to do. It has to pull the whole world of Walt Disney back to his origin and become morally final. The script helps with that because Vera answers Walt directly. She doesn't let the song close the case, but the composition still has to navigate that dangerous territory. It has to let us hear the ache in his heart without letting that ache become acquittal. That's sophisticated musical drama, folks. Now, before I move on, I want to talk about one of the most revealing things in the album itself, the underscore tracks. Because this is part of what makes the full cast recording feel so significant. The stage script gives us 18 principal musical numbers. Now, that's the stage musical skeleton. The full cast recording, though, is 25 tracks, and the extra material is telling. The album includes pieces like The Lost Boy's Message, Scuffle in the Show, Apology Accepted, Walt Retires, Look at the Time, plus The Bows and the Steamboat Willie revived song. All of those previously mentioned pieces are all underscores. That means the album is not just preserving singable highlights, it's preserving connective tissue, and that's a big deal because underscore is where musicals often reveal how seriously they take themselves as drama. Songs are obvious. Songs get clipped for social media. They get posted, quoted, covered, extracted. But underscore is where you discover where the show thinks musically between the songs. And Dis-topia clearly thinks between the songs. The decision to put underscore on the album tells you that the team understands that the score is continuous dramaturgy. The orchestra is not just there for applause points. It's there to hold scenes together, to turn emotional weather, to create threat, bridge tone, and let motifs keep working even when no one is belting. God, I love that. It says the show trusts the audience to care not just about the songs they can hum and remember on the way out, but about the musical mechanics underneath them. That is a composer's instinct, and it's also an archivist's instinct. And for an independent musical, that kind of preservation is rare enough that I think it deserves to be called out plainly. There was a smaller 6-track experimental prototype EP in 2024. Then came the full 25-track cast recording in 2025. In full studio sound recording, with the full orchestra and the full cast. Now that progression is not just a release strategy. It reflects a show that kept expanding its confidence in its own musical identity. And that feels right to me, because the score itself sounds like a show that knows it cannot be reduced to 3 best songs and a Spotify sampler. This is a thorough, composed world, or at least a world that wants to be heard as more than isolated singles. Now, before I get into the second half material and the orchestra itself, let me pause here, because up to this point, I've been talking mostly about the score in terms of character and dramatic language. But when I come back, I want to focus on the orchestra and the cast album as an act of artistic legitimacy and a few of the most important musical relationships in the show, especially the way Dis-topia keeps turning Disney sound back on itself without ever losing sight of why Disney sound works in the first place. I'll be right back with more right after this short break. Welcome back. So, let's pick up with the orchestra. Because one of the easiest mistakes people can make when talking about a musical like Dis-topia, and to be honest, I've said that a lot, but is there really a musical like Dis-topia at this point? But if they were talking about a musical like Dis-topia, you're going to assume that full orchestra is basically just shorthand for big. And yes, obviously it is big. A mid-20s orchestra on an independent production is not small by any normal standard, and the public reporting around the 2024 thesis production emphasized that scale. The Daily Bruin said the show had instrumental changes from its 2021 premiere, including a 25-person orchestra that Robby Good conducted, while his official project page now describes the 2024 premiere as featuring 27 musicians. Even allowing for a slight discrepancy in how players are counted, the point is clear. This was not a reduced keyboard conductor pit trying to fake the size of a Broadway house band. This was a genuinely expansive orchestral undertaking. But size is not the most important part. Color is. Function is. A full orchestra matters artistically when it lets the show distribute emotional information more precisely. Strings can carry ache, suspension, lift, and the feeling of an older, romanticized musical world. Brass can carry pageantry, command, false confidence, institutional pomp, or grotesque overstatement. Woodwinds can suggest innocence, motion, whimsy, nostalgia, or fragility. Percussion can do more than just keep time. It can industrialize a groove, militarize a march, sharpen a protest song, or give a public number the feeling of choreography being imposed from above. That is why a score like Dis-topia's benefits so much from orchestral breadth. This is a show about competing environments. The orchestra lets those environments have bodies. Think about what the official project page says at a glance. 18 original stage songs, classic Disney-esque nostalgia, punctuated rock music, dark comedy grounded in drama. That combination almost demands a wider instrumental palette, because the whole point is that these sounds need to live side by side without flattening each other. If Vera's world is all melodic glow and no edge, she becomes saccharine. If Kat's world is all distortion and no musical intelligence, they become one note. And if Walt's world is all grandeur and no bitterness, he becomes myth instead of problem. Orchestral color is one of the main things that prevents that from happening. And I think that's what Good meant when he said that the music gets to be a character and that the soundtrack should make the arc of the show audible. He's talking about more than melody there. He's talking about score as narrative pressure. Now, there's another reason the orchestra matters here, and it has to do with thematic hybridity. Yeah, I know, I'm using a lot of big words, but to be honest, this is my kind of forte, guys. I'm really going into the music theory of it all. So, you know what? Let's just have some fun. One of the recurring traps in writing about musicals is treating musical theater like it's just song plus plot, when in reality, a lot of the most intelligent storytelling happens in how styles are combined, interrupted, quoted, or denied. And Dis-topia is fundamentally a hybrid musical. It's not a pure pastiche piece, it's not a pure rock musical, it's not a conventional golden age inheritance piece. It's a hybrid work about a hybrid emotional problem. Part of its world is built on the emotional memory of Disney musical language. The other part of its world is built on labor, anger, sarcasm, collapse, friction, and refusal. And the other part of its world is built on corporate ritual and propaganda. And because all of that exists in the same show, the score has to behave almost like a contested public space. Different musical forces are always trying to claim the city. That's what makes numbers like Freedom of Control and Freedom of Gratitude so interesting to me musically. They're not just argument songs, they're territorial songs. Walt is trying to reclaim sonic space. He's trying to make the city sound like his voice again. And those songs need the orchestra to back that up. They need confidence, they need command, they need the musical equivalent of someone grabbing the microphone and insisting that authority still belongs to them. Then, compare that to Slay the Beast. That number needs crowd weight, it needs rally force, it needs enough musical propulsion that it doesn't sound like a private complaint. In the script, the song is explicitly a public protest number, and it's gotta feel like one. You want pulse, you want direction, you want the sense that individual anger has turned into communal rhythm. And that's one of the places where an expanded ensemble and a fuller orchestra base can really matter, because a protest song that is musically undernourished never feels like a public threat. Which brings me to something else I love about the album track list. If you're keeping count, there is a lot. It reveals that Dis-topia is not shy about giving its musical world afterlives. Look Forward Towards Tomorrow gets a lullaby version on the album. That is incredibly telling. That means the show is interested not only in presenting a song in its public form, but in showing how its material can be repurposed, miniaturized, or emotionally reframed. That's the kind of thing you do when you think motivically, and not just episodically. And that is exactly the sort of choice that makes me think the score deserves serious attention. Why do you think I'm dedicating an entire 3-part deep dive episode series into this entire musical? A lullaby version of that song isn't just bonus content. It's analysis through composition. It tells you that the material has secondary lives. That it can be sweet where it was once uncanny, or uncanny where it was once reassuring. That's the kind of relationship building inside a score that makes a musical feel architected rather than merely assembled. The same logic applies to Graveyard Muse and Never. Now they're combined into one song on the album. Those tracks are not just adjacent in plot, they belong together emotionally. Graveyard Muse creates the cemetery stillness and reflective distance. Never is the collapse. Pairing them on the album recognizes that the score is often working in emotional transitions and not just isolated set pieces. Now, that is a composer thinking dramatically. I also want to talk about the Disney references in the musical, because obviously there are going to be references, and I think that's one of the easiest places for commentary to become either too fuzzy or too simplistic. When people hear that Dis-topia draws on Disney-esque nostalgia, they can sometimes imagine that means imitation. But the more interesting question is not whether the score sounds vaguely Disney. The more interesting question is what it does with the fact that Disney musical language is already emotionally loaded. That is the part that matters. And the public comments from both Robby Good and Abby Torrance suggest that they totally understand that. Robby pointed to the Sherman Brothers and the need to find his voice between contrasting styles, while Abby mentioned references to things like Mary Poppins and When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio, with the hope of finding musical Easter eggs the way Disney does in animation. Now that tells me the influence here is not just Sonic cosplay, it's a structural understanding of how musical memory operates inside Disney storytelling, which is so much better than surface parody. It makes the show not really want to make fun of Disney music for existing. It wants to ask what happens when that kind of musical promise gets rooted through power, labor, exploitation, and a city that no longer allows people to opt out of the fantasy. So the score can't reject the promise entirely. It has to let the promise work, and then it has to complicate it. That's where the artistry is. That's why I think that the Vera material is so crucial. Vera is the proof that the show still believes in the emotional efficacy of this musical language. If the show did not believe that Disney-shaped feeling could ever be real, then Vera would just be pathetic, and her music would be dead on arrival. Instead, her songs are allowed to carry actual warmth, openness, and emotional relief. Which means when the show later asks whether Neverland can survive, that question is not ironic. It's sincere. And the sincerity is one of the most difficult things to compose for. The show has to let the audience feel why fantasy mattered before it critiques the structure fantasy has been used to support, which is not a small job. Now, there is another musical detail I think deserves real attention, and it's the way that this score seems to understand repetition. Not just reprise, repetition with argument. A lot of the major song titles already tell you the score is thinking in pairs and returns. This happy place, his happy place, Neverland, never, Neverland tomorrow, freedom of control, freedom of gratitude, look forward towards tomorrow, and then the lullaby version of it. It's not accidental. It's score mapping of its own obsessions. Words return because ideas return, and then they evolve. Titles return because emotional positions return in altered form, And when a score does that well, it starts behaving almost like a conversation with itself. This happy place is public mythology. His happy place narrows the lens and reveals the psychological ownership inside the same phrase. Marceline then pushes even deeper into origin memory and the private myth underneath the public dream. In the script terms, those are three very distinct and different moments for Walt. In compositional terms, they should feel related but not interchangeable, which is a very sophisticated assignment for any composer. And yet, this score makes it look easy. Likewise with Vera. Neverland is assertion, whereas Never is devastation. But Neverland Tomorrow is reconstruction. A very clear and beautiful musical arc, even before you start analyzing any specific harmonic or thematic details. The score is telling you, right in the title, that Vera's journey is not from fantasy to realism. It's from inherited fantasy to broken fantasy and then to self-authored future. The score does something especially smart at the Act 1 climax. In the script, for Neverland, Vera, Katz, and Walt all end up musically coexisting in the same argument. Their lines collide. They share the stage. They all insist on my world or our world. And that's not just dramatic overlap, that's compositional compression. The show is taking three incompatible worldviews and forcing them into the same musical space, which is exactly what a first act climax should do. It shouldn't just merely be the biggest song. It's got to be the most concentrated version of the musical's central conflict. I want to say something briefly about studio recording, because it's easy to talk about the cast album only as a marketing or archival object, when actually, it also functions as a claim. A full cast recording says, this score is worth living beyond the room. That's the claim. And in the case of Dis-topia, I think that matters even more because of the show's origin. This was not a giant commercial property securing a cast album as a matter of routine. This was a piece that began in student and independent production spaces, evolved through workshops, emerged in thesis-scale production, and then received a full official cast recording release in 2025. Robby's site now links the soundtrack directly, and it was officially released on March 28, 2025. Now that's not routine. That's a statement. It states that the music is not secondary evidence of the show. It says that it's part of the show's long-term life. And honestly, I think that is one reason this whole trilogy felt worth doing on the podcast side after the two-part video I did. Because once a musical has a real script, a real score, a real production history, a real cast recording, and a real musical identity, it stops being merely that wild thing online about people talking about Epcot and singing with an unfrozen head of Walt Disney. It enters a different category. Not because it suddenly becomes about criticism or above eccentricity, because it has accrued form and substance, and music is the main reason. Now, as I start bringing this episode towards its conclusion, I want to pull together what I think the score is ultimately doing. For me, the shortest way to say it is this, and I know that sounds like it's going to be impossible considering how long these episodes have been, but you've bared with me this long, bear with me a little bit longer. The music in Dis-topia is where the show's contradictions become audible. The book can tell you that Vera and Katz are opposites. The score can tell you that they are built out of different emotional logics. The book can tell you that Walt is visionary and controlling. The score can make those two things feel inseparable. The book can tell you Epcot is all surface and underbelly. The orchestra can make those layers sound like different climates in the same space. And that's why the score matters. It's also why the full orchestral ambition matters. Because a show about a giant controlled environment about buried labor and public sheen and competing definitions of tomorrow, deserves a musical world with enough size and detail to carry all of that. A smaller arrangement can still be excellent, of course. I'm not fetishizing scale for its own sake. But in Dis-topia, scale is part of the point. This is a musical about bigness, big vision, big myth, big machinery, big feeling, big delusion, big public rhetoric. A fuller orchestra lets the score meet the premise on that level. And then the cast album does something equally important. It lets us hear that the show was never only a script idea. It was always a musical argument. A musical argument about what Disney sound does to people. A musical argument about whether innocence can survive critique. About whether rebellion can speak only in abrasion, or whether it must eventually learn new forms of tenderness. A musical about how nostalgia curdles, how propaganda sings, how memory haunts, and how tomorrow can be weaponized or reclaimed depending on who gets to orchestrate it. That's what I hear in this score. And to me, it's why I was ending the trilogy on the music. It felt right. Episode 1 was history. Episode 2, dramatic architecture. And this one, part 3, sound. Sound is where history and structure become feeling. And that's what this score was doing, and continues to do. It's taking Walt Disney's Impossible City, Matthew Deegan's script, alongside his work with Abby Torrance and Robby Good, and the emotional, ideological lanes inside that script, and turning them into something you can hear as conflict before you finish naming the conflict. That's the achievement. Not just that there are good songs here. Of course there are. You've been listening to it through all 3 episodes. And it's not just that the album exists, though obviously that is very impressive. The real achievement is that the score seems to understand the exact challenge that the show set for itself. How do you make a musical that can sound enchanted and suspicious at the same time? How do you let Disney-shaped feeling remain emotionally real while still interrogating the institution that taught so many people how to feel that way? How do you score a city where fantasy is both refuge and the instrument of control? That's difficult work. And Dis-topia, from everything in the script, the creator's comments, the released album materials, it really does seem to take that work seriously. So, if I had to sum up this final episode in one sentence, it would be impossible, but I'm going to try. So I think I'll say this. The music of Dis-topia works because it's not just accompanying the script. It's because it's arguing with it, deepening it, haunting it, and ultimately proving that this strange musical about an experimental prototype community of tomorrow brought to life understands exactly how much power lives inside the sounds it's borrowing, bending, and reclaiming. It's why the score matters. It's why the orchestra matters. It's why the cast album matters. It's why the crew matters. It's why every person who funded the project matters. It's why every single one of you that likes and shares those sounds on TikTok and Instagram, and every clip you see and every person who likes the video on YouTube and watches it matters. And that's why, for me, Dis-topia became a 3-part conversation instead of a one-off curiosity. In fact, it's so much of a curiosity that it makes me curious, where could Dis-topia end up next? The ambition of a project like this simply cannot be contained to just a one-off performance over a weekend in California. What does the future hold for Dis-topia? All we know is that it will be worth it for tomorrow. And as the song goes, tomorrow is just a dream away.
Though I'm stacked against the odds, and no one understands, they'll
Thank you for joining me on this final chapter in the trilogy, and thank you to the cast, crew, creators, and all of the supporters of Dis-topia, the Epcot musical. I've been Michael St. Gregory, and I'll see you real soon.